Hi guys, welcome to another video, and in this one I wanted to do another update for the Titan Bear SLAMS build because we're now in day 2 and there's actually been quite a few changes to the build. The first thing that I want to discuss is the weapon swap tech that I've implemented into this build. So previously I had a plan where I was going to kind of use my weapon swap to do Warcries and gain a lot of benefits on the Warcry from all of the extra nodes there on the tree around where I was pathing, you know, things like Warcry speed, empowered attack damage, stuff like that. And I'm still doing that, but I've now implemented some tech where pretty much the only rage generation I need is coming from my Warcry, and then I'm also using Walking Calamity now in the build because the skill is just so good that you basically cannot pass it up. I think they made it maybe a little bit too strong compared to the other stuff, but we'll discuss that in a moment. So first of all, Ferocious Roar. This is what I can do in this build now to get a ridiculous amount of rage. I can just spam this skill, and you can see that just one use of the skill gets me to about 30 rage or something like that, 40 rage. And what's going on there is I'm using some support gems in Ferocious Roar to actually generate a bunch of rage. Now, Ferocious Roar on its own already generates a bunch of rage. You gain 3 rage per enemy power in range, but that actually counts default power coming from the tree. And there's a node on the tree that will actually allow you to gain power as a baseline, a minimum of 10 power, which means that that's actually going to, you know, translate to this granting you a bunch of rage automatically without any enemies being in range. So 3 rage per enemy power in range, and on top of that we also have Raging Cry, which is 4 rage per 5 power on top. So you get a ton of rage gain just from these two things combined. And then when you combine that with Enraged Cry, or Enraged Warcry, which is another support gem, this says supported Warcries spend 20 rage to bypass their cooldown instead of an endurance charge. So what that means is we can just spam like this, and there's a couple of things going on there. Now you may be wondering, why do I need to spend rage? Because I'm already generating endurance charges, and the Warcry already has a thing that allows it to spend an endurance charge to bypass the cooldown. Well, there's a reason for that, and there's also a reason I'm using Enraged Warcry 1 rather than Enraged Warcry 2. This one spends 20 rage, whereas the upgraded version of this support gem spends 15. And this is important for the weapon swap tech that I'm using, because I'm using this new unique talisman called Amor Mandragora, which is this thing that grants you Druidic Prowess, which is a buff that is actually quite powerful. It's basically a bunch of skill speed, and there's some extra stuff there with spell damage granting rage. We're not interested in that, we don't do any spell damage on this build. But it's 10% skill speed per stack, and it stacks up to 10 seconds. And the way this works is you gain 1 Druidic Prowess, stack of the buff, for 10 seconds, for every 20 total rage spent. So if we have this on our offhand with the Warcry setup, and we spend that 20 rage, we immediately gain that buff. And you can see there, I'm immediately at 3 stacks, and that's 30% skill speed, which is actually very, very nice. And on top of that, it means that I get to always keep my endurance charges, which is nice for something else that I've introduced into the build, which is charge regulation. So charge regulation is just granting me a bunch of more defenses. There's more armor going on there, which is nice with my armor stacking that I've got going on. I've got quite a lot of armor scaling on the tree, and I'm also using scavenge plating. The armor break, by the way, for scavenge plating comes from Ferocious Roar, which empowers attacks to break armor. So I know that I didn't actually mention that in the previous video. And prior to that, my plan was to use the mark coming from Pounce, which then you can support with, you know, mark for death. But I've actually dropped Pounce from the build. I'll discuss that in a moment. But yeah, so this is basically the weapon swap tech that we've got going on here now. And what this means is that when I actually first enter a map, I can basically immediately have Walking Calamity ready in just 1.5 seconds of just spamming the Warcry like this. Walking Calamity's ready, and then we just go, right? So generating rage for Walking Calamity is just so easy now with this. And yeah, that has made mapping a lot smoother, because Walking Calamity is such a huge boost to actually, you know, general mapping and clear and things like that. And Walking Calamity itself is actually such a nice buff for us, even though this thing does a lot of damage on its own. The buff grants 30% damage gained as extra fire. It also does a bunch of kind of extra clearing, and it grants you rage generation as well. So whilst you actually have this buff up, you don't really need to worry about running out of rage or anything like that, even though, you know, we get so much rage from our Warcry every time we use it. Now, something else to talk about with the Warcry is how much Warcry speed I have for this skill. Now, if I head over to the passive tree, I can actually show you just how much there is. I've got a bunch of Warcry speed here. This is 12%, 24%, 24%, another 24% here. And then over here, there's also all this skill speed works for Warcries as well. And all the skill speed coming from the buff also works for Warcries, the Druidic Prowess. And we've got even more here, another 24% on these two nodes here. And here's another 24%, another 24%, and 25%. So all of that together adds up to a ridiculous amount of Warcry speed. You can actually see here how fast this is to use. It's 0.34 seconds, and that's without the buff. So if we just use this a little bit, so you can see how much this is going to be now. 0.31 seconds. Okay, so it takes that amount of time for the bear to actually stand up, you know, from being on all fours. And the reason why I want to discuss that is because in the last video I was kind of talking about how, you know, there was a bit of a problem there in the early game with how slow the slam comes out. And part of that problem comes from the Furious Slam has this modifier here, plus 0.4 seconds to base attack time if not standing. So if you're not actually, you know, standing up like this, then it's going to be an extra 0.4 seconds. Now, what I've been doing now that I've got that Warcry set up and now that I have so much speed is that when I'm mapping, I just kind of use the raw and then immediately slam, which is actually faster than just using the slam itself. I mean, you can see that here. When I'm using the slam, pretty slow. Use the Warcry into the slam, it's faster. So that is basically the setup that I'm going for right now in terms of, you know, mapping and doing damage. And that has actually been working quite well, mostly because the AoE on Furious Slam is absolutely huge. I mean, you can see how much area effect this is covering. It's pretty huge. It's even larger than that in a map because I also have some modifiers on the tree. For example, this one over here, which is 25% increased area effect if you've stunned an enemy recently, and we basically have always stunned enemies whenever we're mapping, so, you know, that's a lot of extra area of effect. So let's get back to charge regulation. Now, I was using this skill for a little bit, and I really like it because, you know, it's just basically a bonus 19% more defenses that never goes away because we're always generating endurance charges. And I thought, how can I generate frenzy charges for that 24% increased skill speed? Because I'm already using this skill, so I want to kind of gain the most out of it. And one of the things that I've been doing, which I'm not really convinced this is going to progress into the endgame version of the build once I'm kind of fully done with it, but I've been using Lightning Coil as my body armor because that makes us take a portion of physical damage from hits as lightning damage, and that means that we can reliably take lightning damage pretty much all the time when getting hit, and that kind of factors into Valako's Roar there, which is a charm, a Topaz charm that grants a frenzy charge on use, and it's procced when taking lightning damage. And that has meant that during mapping I'm able to pretty consistently keep up at least one frenzy charge whilst just, you know, running through the map, which means that I always have that 24% increased skill speed. And on top of that, the Lightning Coil has made me quite a bit tankier. I've actually noticed how much of a boost that's been. Armor is still one of these things in Path of Exile 2 where it is pretty decent when you really heavily invest into it, but it's quite hard to get it to a point where it's really, really powerful. And once you do, it's kind of this very heavy investment where you've invested a huge amount of resources into actually getting there, and it's usually taking away from your damage. So this is kind of a thing that I'm doing where I'm trying to make the most of charge regulation there. Now, part of the other tech there going on with the weapon swap, because we're still not done, is Savage Fury. And Savage Fury is, I'm pretty sure this is a bug, but I mean, I'm using it in the build at the moment, and we'll see if it does get patched out. If it does get patched out, it's not the end of the world. But Savage Fury, you can actually have this in your offhand. So you can see right now, this is assigned to weapon set 2. And even in your main weapon set, you're still going to be, you know, you're going to be benefiting from the buff. So you'll still be able to actually gain Fury whilst you're in your main weapon set, even though it's attached to your second weapon set. And then when you actually use the skill, you will use it based on your other weapon set. So you actually swap to that weapon. And the crazy thing about that is we even get a bit of bonus skill effect duration here, 15% on this weapon. So that's just even more skill effect duration for Savage Fury when it does go off. But as I say, I'm pretty sure this is a bug because it just doesn't seem like that's intentionally meant to be working like that. That's basically just always, like, this is just a free buff, right, in that case. And how I'm actually doing that is that I'm reserving Savage Fury in my offhand, and then I'm reserving Overwhelming Presence only in my main hand, so that way I'm kind of gaining 2 buffs at the same time. So I'm basically gaining 60 spirit worth of buffs for 30 spirit. because, you know, I don't do any damage in my offhand, and therefore Overwhelming Presence isn't actually doing anything when I'm actually in my offhand. The only time I'm in my offhand is when I use a Warcry, and then I'm immediately back into my main hand. Now, in terms of the gear, there's not really too much going on here. My weapon desperately needs an upgrade. This is kind of really bad weapon for where I'm at right now. I don't have any gem levels or attack speed on there, so that's the next thing I'm looking at upgrading. But generally, progression's going just fine, even with this poor weapon, so that's, you know, that is what it is. I think there's going to be a lot of damage for this build when I actually get there, and I haven't even got my last Ascension yet either. I'm currently missing 1 point. I am using Earthbreaker right now because I actually think this is a better node for the kind of progression. It's just 25% chance for Aftershocks there, and this one is the only damage bonus you're getting is when the target's actually heavy stunned. So I kind of prefer this a little bit for progressional. I am still going to try out this branch. I've heard kind of mixed things about Mountain Splitter. I've heard some people saying that it can overlap, some people saying it can't overlap, so I'm going to have to test that out myself and see exactly what's going on. But regardless, even if this doesn't work, I think we'll probably end up going for something like Earthbreaker and Ancestral Empowerment, or maybe Earthbreaker plus Mysterious Lineage. There's actually a lot of things you could do here. You could even go for armor scaling. You could go for, you know, Crushing Impacts and Earthbreaker. There's just a lot of good things for this type of build. And since we're mostly dealing damage with our SLAM, there's just so much support on this Ascendancy for SLAMs. Now, for the passive tree, there's also not many changes. The only thing that I've done there is basically incorporated that Warcry wheel that I was talking about earlier, which this one grants nice Warcry speed here. There's also the inflicts 3 critical weakness on enemies. I don't know how useful this is going to be. I have it spec'd in the second weapon set, and there is potential there for the build to go kind of more of a crit focus in the end game if you get, you know, really, really good gear. But as it is, I mean, I don't think this is that good, but it could be useful later on. I will also mention that I've completely dropped Fury of the Mountain, if that wasn't already obvious. That was kind of the rage generation for the build, especially for bossing. And now I just don't need anything like that because I have so much rage generation from the Warcry combined with Walking Calamity. There's just always enough rage there to be able to, you know, use all my skills and then some, so that's just going just fine. I'm still using Shockwave Totem. That's there to explode the jagged ground from the SLAM, so this only comes out for single target, and it's pretty good for that. Now, the last thing I'll discuss in this video is why I removed Pounce from the build. And Pounce is actually a really cool skill, but there's currently another bug going on, and I'll just quickly discuss exactly what's going on with that. So, basically, Pounce is a skill that turns you into a werewolf, and it kind of leaps you across the screen like this. Now, there's nothing on Ferocious Roar like the other skills. For example, if you look on Ferocious Slam, there's this line here that says plus 0.4 seconds to base attack time, or base use time, I should say, when shapeshifting, right? There's nothing like that on Ferocious Roar. My guess is the line is actually there and it's missing from the skill gem. And, well, I can show you why it's there, because when you're in werewolf form and you use the Warcry, it is insanely slow, right? So I can show you exactly how slow that is. I'm just locked in the animation for so long. You can see it right there. Every time I use the Warcry out of wolf form, it takes really long. And when it's not in wolf form, this is how fast it is. In wolf form, super slow. So you can imagine that when I'm leaping into a pack of monsters with this, and then I'm trying to Warcry, I'm actually just getting hit to death whilst I'm trying to Warcry. So I don't know what's going on there with Ferocious Roar. I think the line that says, you know, when transforming is missing from the gem, or it's just bugged. One or the other. If this was working as it should do, then it would be exactly the same speed when transforming from a wolf, and I would have actually kept Pounce in the build, because Pounce is really nice mobility. Yeah, because of that, I was basically just getting hit to death whilst I was just trying to Warcry out the wolf form, so that's a bit unfortunate. That's why Pounce is gone. And it is what it is. But that is pretty much it for the day 2 update for the build. I'm currently level 84, and I'll be going for that, you know, final ascension here at some point. I actually have all the stuff ready to go, so I should probably do that at some point. And then I'll be able to test out those other nodes and see exactly what's going on. But I hope you guys are enjoying the league. Thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.